Intelligence is supposed to protect you, but psychology shows something uncomfortable. Intelligence doesn't remove mental traps. It often gives them better hiding places. Tonight, we'll look at 20 mental shortcuts, simple patterns the brain uses to save effort, that quietly cause smart people to fail in predictable ways. If this kind of calm psychological breakdown helps you think or sleep, consider subscribing and liking the video. And as you listen, comment which shortcut felt most familiar to you. There's nothing you need to do right now. Just listen and let your mind slow down. There is a moment that happens quietly inside a lot of smart people. You are explaining something perfectly. Every reason lines up. The logic is airtight. And yet the person across from you pulls away, shuts down, or does the exact opposite of what makes sense. In your head you are thinking this should work. I am right. The facts are clear. But instead of winning, you lose the room, not because you are wrong, but because you treated humans like math problems. Here is the uncomfortable truth most intelligent people never want to face. Logic does not drive human behavior. Emotion does. Logic only justifies what emotion has already decided. When smart people forget this, they sabotage relationships, careers, leadership, and even their own happiness. They keep trying to think their way out of problems that can only be felt through. Think about the last argument you had where you were 100% correct. You had examples. You had reasons. You probably even rehearsed it in your head beforehand, and still it ended badly. The other person did not feel understood. They felt attacked, dismissed, or small. In that moment, your intelligence did not protect you. It betrayed you. This is where it gets brutal. Overvaluing logic while ignoring emotional reality feels like maturity. It feels like discipline. It feels like being above drama. But in real life, it often comes across as cold, arrogant, or disconnected. And the more intelligent you are, the easier it is to fall into this trap, because your brain is trained to optimize for correctness, not connection. Neuroscience explains why this keeps happening. The emotional centers of the brain process information faster than the rational ones. Emotion happens first. Logic follows. When someone feels threatened, unheard, or invalidated, their nervous system shifts into defense. At that point, no amount of reasoning will land. You are talking to a wall, but the wall is a human nervous system trying to protect itself. Smart people often miss this because they assume the conversation is happening on the logical level when it is actually happening on the emotional one. This shows up everywhere. A manager gives clear feedback and cannot understand why the employee disengages. A partner explains why something should not matter and wonders why the other person still feels hurt. A founder makes the rational decision and loses the trust of the team. In each case, the logic may be sound, but the emotional cost is ignored. And humans always collect that cost later with interest. What makes this especially dangerous is that smart people are rewarded for this behavior early in life. In school, logic wins. In tests, logic wins. In debates, logic wins. You learn that being right equals being successful. But real life is not an exam. It is a negotiation of feelings, identities, fears, and unspoken needs. When intelligence becomes your identity, it becomes very hard to admit that logic alone is not enough. Here is the part that stings. When you dismiss emotion, you are not being rational. You are being incomplete. Emotion is data. It tells you what matters, where resistance lies, and what people are protecting. Ignoring it is like ignoring half the map, and then blaming the terrain when you get lost. There is also a hidden emotional payoff in overvaluing logic. It keeps you safe. If everything is about reason, you never have to be vulnerable. You never have to admit uncertainty. You never have to sit with discomfort. Logic becomes armor, and armor feels powerful until it starts isolating you. If you have ever wondered why people say you are intimidating, distant, or hard to talk to, this might be why. Not because you lack empathy, but because you try to solve feelings instead of understanding them. People do not want to be fixed. They want to be felt. The shift happens when you realize that emotional reality does not compete with logic. It completes it. When you acknowledge how someone feels before explaining what you think, their brain stays open. When you validate emotion before offering reason, your logic actually lands. This is not manipulation. It is alignment with how humans work. The smartest people who succeed long-term learn this lesson the hard way. They stop asking what makes sense and start asking what feels true to the person in front of them. They slow down. They listen for emotion underneath words. They realize that being understood is more powerful than being correct. And once you see this pattern, you start noticing how often intelligence fails not because it lacks answers, but because it lacks emotional awareness. That realization changes how you communicate, how you lead, and how you connect. It also reveals how many other mental shortcuts quietly undermine smart people in ways they never expect. Mistaking confidence for correctness somewhere along the way, confidence stopped being a signal and started being a shortcut. You see someone speak clearly, decisively, without hesitation, and your brain jumps to the conclusion that they must know what they are talking about. And if you are a smart person, you are especially vulnerable to this because you pride yourself on recognizing competence. You think you can spot it instantly. But that instinct is exactly where things go wrong. Here is the unsettling part. Confidence feels like evidence, but it is not. It is a performance. And the human brain is wired to confuse the two because confidence reduces uncertainty. When someone sounds sure, your nervous system relaxes. You stop questioning. You stop checking. You outsource your thinking. That is how bad ideas spread fast and good ideas get ignored quietly. History is full of confident people who were wrong in catastrophic ways. Leaders who spoke with absolute certainty while making disastrous decisions. Experts who dismissed warnings because they sounded less sure. Entire organizations collapsing because one voice was loud and calm while others hesitated. The scary part is not that they were wrong. It is that their confidence made everyone else doubt themselves. This happens in everyday life too, not just on big stages. Think about meetings where the most confident person dominates the room, even when their idea is half-baked. Or arguments where the loudest voice wins, not the most accurate one. Or personal decisions where you trusted someone else's certainty over your own quiet intuition and paid for it later. In those moments, confidence did not guide you. It blinded you. Psychology has a name for this: the confidence heuristic. It is a mental shortcut where the brain assumes that certainty equals competence. It saves energy. Instead of analyzing information deeply, the brain uses confidence as a proxy for truth. This works just enough of the time to feel reliable, which makes it dangerous. Because when it fails hard. What makes this especially tricky for smart people is that confidence often correlates with intelligence early on. If you are good at something, you speak about it with ease. Over time, the brain starts linking the feeling of certainty with being right. Eventually, confidence stops being a result of knowledge and starts becoming a substitute for it. There is another layer that is harder to admit. Confidence is contagious. When someone speaks with certainty, it pressures others to fall in line. Disagreeing suddenly feels risky. You start second-guessing yourself, not because you lack reasons, but because you lack certainty. And in many environments, especially professional ones, certainty is rewarded more than accuracy. So people learn to sound sure even when they are not. This creates a quiet distortion. The people who know the most often hedge, qualify, and acknowledge complexity. The people who know the least often speak in absolutes. Smart people can fall into this trap from both sides. Either they defer to confident voices too easily, or they mistake their own confidence for correctness and stop updating their beliefs. The most dangerous version of this shortcut is internal. When you feel confident about a conclusion, you stop testing it. You stop asking what you might be missing. You stop listening. Confidence creates the illusion of closure. It feels like the thinking is done. But that is exactly when mistakes lock in. There is a well-known cognitive effect that explains this pattern. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that people with lower ability often overestimate their competence because they lack the insight to see their gaps. Meanwhile, people with higher ability tend to underestimate themselves because they see how complex the problem really is. Confidence rises fastest at the beginning of knowledge, not at the end. If you do not actively correct for this, you end up trusting the wrong signals. Here is the part that matters. Confidence is not the enemy. Unexamined confidence is. Real competence can coexist with humility. Real understanding makes room for doubt. The smartest people learn to separate how sure something feels from how true it actually is. They do something subtle but powerful. They slow down when they feel most certain. They ask what evidence would change their mind. They notice when confidence is coming from repetition, authority, or comfort instead of facts. They listen more closely to people who speak carefully rather than forcefully. Once you start seeing this, you realize how often confidence hijacks decision-making. How many times you accepted an answer because it sounded clean. How many times you dismissed a warning because it sounded unsure. How many times you doubled down on a belief because backing off would feel like weakness. Correctness does not announce itself loudly. It survives scrutiny. Confidence does not guarantee truth. It only guarantees volume. And if you are not careful, that volume can drown out the signals that actually matter. When you stop equating confidence with being right, your thinking sharpens. You become harder to mislead and harder to trap by your own certainty. And you start noticing how many other mental shortcuts quietly trip up intelligent people, especially when they least expect it. Believing intelligence eliminates personal blind spots. At some point, intelligence quietly turns into a shield. You stop saying it out loud, but you start feeling it. I am self-aware. I think deeply. I question things. So I probably see myself more clearly than most people. That belief settles in slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you have been walking around, assuming your intelligence protects you from your own blind spots. That assumption is one of the most dangerous ones smart people make. Here is the jolt most people do not expect. Intelligence does not remove blind spots. It often makes them harder to see. Because the smarter you are, the better you become at explaining yourself to yourself. You build airtight stories about why you act the way you do. You justify patterns. You rationalize reactions. You turn emotional habits into intellectual theories. and the story sounds so convincing that you stop questioning it. This is where things quietly fall apart. Blind spots are not about lack of intelligence. They are about self-protection. The human mind is not designed to see itself objectively. It is designed to maintain a stable sense of identity. Intelligence does not override that function. It enhances it. A sharp mind becomes a skilled defense attorney for the ego. Think about how this plays out in real life. A smart person insists they are just being honest when others experience them as harsh. They believe they are independent thinkers when they are actually avoiding feedback. They see themselves as logical while repeatedly making the same emotionally driven decisions. From the inside, it all makes sense. From the outside, the pattern is obvious. That gap is the blind spot. Psychology explains this through something called motivated reasoning. Your brain does not ask what is true. It asks what protects the story I already believe about myself. Intelligence gives you more tools to answer that question convincingly. You generate better explanations, not better self-insight. There is also the introspection illusion. People tend to believe that looking inward gives them direct access to their motives and biases. But much of human behavior is driven by processes below conscious awareness. You feel the outcome of a decision and then construct a narrative after the fact. Smart people are especially good at this. The narrative feels thoughtful, nuanced, and rational. That makes it harder to challenge. This creates a strange paradox. The more intelligent you are, the more confident you become in your self-assessment. And the more confident you become, the less likely you are to notice where you are wrong. Blind spots thrive in confidence, not ignorance. You can see this in high-performing environments all the time. Brilliant leaders who cannot see how their behavior shuts people down. Talented professionals who cannot recognize the patterns holding their career back. Intelligent friends who repeat the same relational mistakes while insisting they have already reflected on them. They are not lying. They genuinely cannot see it. What makes this painful is that feedback feels insulting when you believe you are self-aware. If someone points out a pattern, your mind immediately starts explaining why they are mistaken or why this situation is different. The smarter you are, the faster and more convincing that defense becomes. You are not resisting growth. You think you already did the work. Here is the hard truth. Self-awareness is not a trait you earn once. It is a process you practice repeatedly. Intelligence helps you understand ideas. It does not automatically help you see yourself clearly. In fact, it often creates the illusion that you already do. There is also an emotional cost to admitting blind spots. It threatens the identity of being perceptive, thoughtful, and above basic mistakes. For smart people, that identity is often central. Letting go of it feels like losing ground. So the mind protects it quietly by filtering what you notice about yourself. The people who actually grow the most are not the smartest in the room. They are the most willing to be uncomfortable with how little they see. They assume blind spots exist, even when they cannot find them. They treat feedback as data instead of an attack. They understand that insight from the inside will always be incomplete. One of the most reliable signs of intelligence maturity is not confidence in self-awareness, but skepticism of it. The ability to say, I might be missing something, even when everything feels clear. That sentence alone cracks open blind spots that intelligence by itself never will. When you stop believing intelligence makes you immune, you start noticing patterns instead of stories. You pay attention to outcomes instead of intentions. You listen differently when multiple people point to the same issue, and slowly, the blind spots that once felt invisible start to come into focus. That shift is uncomfortable. It destabilizes the image you have of yourself. But it is also where real growth begins. Because intelligence is powerful, but unchecked intelligence is fragile. And many smart people fail not because they lack insight, but because they assume they already have it. Overthinking simple decisions until action collapses. It usually starts with something small. A decision that should take 5 minutes stretches into an hour, then a day, then it quietly expires without ever being made. You tell yourself you are being thorough, responsible, strategic. But underneath that story, something else is happening. The decision is no longer being improved by thought. It is being suffocated by it. This is one of the most common failure points for intelligent people, and almost no one talks about it honestly. Overthinking simple decisions does not feel like a flaw. It feels like care. It feels like depth. It feels like you are protecting yourself from mistakes. But what it actually does is freeze momentum until action collapses under its own weight. Here is the shock most smart people resist. Overthinking is not advanced thinking. It is anxiety wearing the mask of intelligence. When the brain keeps looping on a simple choice, it is not searching for the best option anymore. It is trying to eliminate the discomfort of uncertainty, and uncertainty cannot be solved with more thought. The human brain evolved to make fast decisions with incomplete information. When you force it to wait for perfect clarity, it does something predictable. It panics quietly. It generates more variables, more scenarios, more what-ifs. Each new layer feels productive, but none of it moves you closer to action. You are not stuck because the decision is complex. You are stuck because the stakes feel emotional. This shows up everywhere. You delay sending a message because you want the wording to be perfect. You postpone starting a project because you are still refining the plan. You keep researching instead of choosing. From the outside, it looks like procrastination. From the inside, it feels like responsibility. That is why it is so dangerous. Psychology explains this through something called analysis paralysis. When too many options or variables are considered, the brain becomes overloaded and defaults to inaction. What makes smart people especially vulnerable is that they can generate endless possibilities. Every outcome branches into more outcomes. Every choice reveals more risks. The mind never runs out of material to chew on. There is also a hidden identity trap here. For intelligent people, thinking is the strength. Action feels messy. Action involves exposure. Once you act, reality responds, and reality does not care how smart your reasoning was. So the mind stays where it feels powerful in thought. Over time, thinking replaces doing. The cruel irony is that simple decisions are often low cost and high feedback. You learn by acting, not by perfecting the plan. But overthinking blocks that feedback loop. Without action, you never get new information. Without new information, the mind keeps recycling the same thoughts. It feels like progress, but it is stagnation. There is also fear hiding underneath. Fear of choosing wrong. Fear of wasted effort. Fear of regret. Smart people are especially sensitive to this because they are aware of consequences. They can imagine failure vividly. The brain treats imagined failure almost the same as real failure, so it tries to avoid both by delaying the choice. What is rarely acknowledged is that not choosing is still a choice, and it often has worse consequences than choosing imperfectly. Opportunities decay, energy fades, confidence erodes. Each time action collapses, The mind learns a subtle lesson. Thinking keeps me safe. Acting feels dangerous. That lesson compounds. You can see this pattern in people with incredible potential who never seem to move. They are always preparing, always optimizing, always almost ready. Their intelligence becomes a waiting room instead of a launch pad. The way out of this is not to think less. It is to change what thinking is for. Instead of asking what is the best decision, you ask what is the smallest decision I can make to get feedback. You stop treating simple choices like permanent verdicts and start treating them like experiments. Neuroscience shows that action reduces anxiety more effectively than rumination. Once you move, the brain gets new sensory input. That interrupts the loop. Even imperfect action restores a sense of agency. You feel less trapped because you are no longer inside your head alone. Highly effective people understand this intuitively. They reserve deep thinking for complex problems and default to speed for simple ones. They trust that correction is easier than prediction. They accept that clarity often comes after action, not before it. The moment you notice yourself overthinking something small, that is the cue. Not to think harder, but to move sooner. Send the message. Make the call. Choose the option that is good enough. Action is not the reward for certainty. Certainty is often the result of action. When you stop letting overthinking collapse your momentum, something shifts. Decisions regain their proper size. Confidence grows from experience instead of speculation. And you start to see how often intelligence does not fail because it lacks answers, but because it refuses to move without guarantees. That realization alone changes how you approach choices, because the goal was never to avoid mistakes. It was to stay in motion, and motion is something overthinking quietly takes away. Assuming past success guarantees future accuracy. Success has a way of changing how you listen to yourself. After a few wins, your inner voice gets louder. Your instincts feel sharper. Your judgment feels proven. You stop saying, "I think this is right," and start feeling this is right. And without realizing it, past success quietly turns into a promise about the future. That promise is false, and it is one of the most reliable ways smart people end up failing in slow, confusing ways. Here is the jolt. Success does not certify accuracy. It only confirms that something worked under a specific set of conditions that no longer fully exist. The moment you forget that, your brain stops learning and starts defending. You are no longer asking what is true now. You are asking, how do I repeat what already made me right before? The human mind loves patterns, especially when they reward us. When a decision leads to success, dopamine reinforces not just the outcome, but the reasoning style behind it. Your brain links the win to your judgment, your instincts, your way of thinking. Over time, that link hardens into identity. I am good at this. I know how this works. I can trust myself here. That is where things quietly break, because reality is not obligated to stay consistent just because you once figured it out. Markets change, people change, context changes, even you change, but the mind prefers continuity over accuracy. It would rather reuse a familiar mental model than rebuild one from scratch. This is why smart people often miss early warning signs. They have a track record. They have experience. And that experience becomes a filter instead of a lens. New information gets interpreted through what already worked before. If it does not fit, it feels wrong. Not because it is wrong, but because it threatens the story of competence. Psychology explains this through something called outcome bias. When a decision leads to a good result, we judge the decision as good, even if it was based on flawed reasoning or luck. Over time, this trains the brain to equate success with correctness. The problem is that luck does not announce itself. It hides inside confidence. There is also survivorship bias at play. You remember the strategies that worked and forget the ones that failed or never got tested. You build a personal mythology of smart choices without seeing how narrow the sample actually is. The past starts to feel like proof instead of context. This shows up everywhere. A leader who built a successful company stops adapting and gets outpaced. A professional who mastered one environment assumes the same instincts apply everywhere else. A smart person who made good calls early in life starts trusting their gut even when the situation is completely different. When things stop working, the instinct is not to question the model. It is to push harder with it. The most dangerous version of this shortcut is subtle. You stop checking your assumptions because you believe you already earned that right. You stop seeking disconfirming evidence. You listen selectively. Your confidence is no longer coming from current understanding, but from historical validation. Neuroscience shows that the brain is energy efficient. Reusing old patterns costs less than building new ones. Past success creates mental shortcuts that feel reliable because they once were. The brain does not naturally update them unless forced to. That force usually comes in the form of failure. By then, the cost is higher. What makes this painful is that success can delay failure long enough to make it worse. Small mismatches between reality and your model get ignored because results still look good. By the time the gap is obvious, the environment has shifted too far to catch up easily. There is also an emotional layer. Letting go of strategies that once defined you feels like erasing part of your identity. If this worked before, then questioning it feels like questioning yourself. Smart people often confuse adaptability with inconsistency. They think changing their mind means they were wrong before, instead of recognizing that being right before does not guarantee being right now. The people who stay accurate over time do something counterintuitive. They treat success as a signal to become more skeptical, not less. They ask what parts of this win were skill, and what parts were timing, context, or luck. They assume conditions are shifting even when things look stable. They also separate confidence from curiosity. They stay confident enough to act, but curious enough to update. They look for where their old models might break. They pay attention to early friction instead of explaining it away. The moment you start believing past success guarantees future accuracy, you stop evolving. You become predictable in a world that rewards adaptation. Intelligence turns rigid. Experience turns stale. When you release that assumption, something opens up. You stop clinging to being right and start prioritizing staying aligned with reality. You listen differently. You test more. You adjust faster. And you realize that the smartest advantage is not a history of success, but the willingness to outgrow it. That shift is uncomfortable because it removes the safety net of your past wins. But it is also what keeps intelligence alive instead of fossilized. Because success is a moment, accuracy is a practice, and confusing the two is how smart people fall behind without noticing until it is too late. Treating first impressions as data instead of guesses. Your brain makes a decision about people faster than you want to admit. Before the conversation really starts, before they finish a sentence, before you have anything close to real information, something inside you already clicks. You feel it. This person is sharp, or unreliable, or impressive, or not worth your time. And if you are intelligent, that feeling does not register as a guess. It registers as insight. That is the trap. First impressions feel like data because they arrive with clarity and speed. There is no hesitation, no uncertainty. Your mind packages a thin slice of behavior into a full story and hands it to you as truth. Smart people are especially vulnerable to this because they trust their pattern recognition. They believe their brain is good at reading signals, and often it is, just not in the way they think. Here is the shock most people do not want to hear. First impressions are not observations, they are predictions. And predictions are shaped more by your internal wiring than by the person in front of you. The brain is constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. When you meet someone new, uncertainty spikes. Your nervous system wants to resolve it fast, so the brain fills in gaps using past experiences, stereotypes, emotional memories, and subtle cues like tone, posture, or appearance. All of this happens automatically before conscious thought catches up. The result feels intuitive. That is why it feels trustworthy. But intuition is not neutral. It is compressed history. Psychology explains this through thin slicing, the brain's ability to draw conclusions from very limited information. Thin slicing can be useful in some contexts, like detecting immediate danger, but it is terrible for understanding complex humans. It optimizes for speed, not accuracy. And when intelligent people treat that output as evidence instead of a hypothesis, mistakes lock in early. You see this play out constantly. Someone seems confident, so you assume they are competent. Someone seems awkward, so you underestimate them. Someone reminds you of a past failure, so you keep your distance. None of this feels like bias in the moment. It feels like reading the room. What makes this especially dangerous is how quickly first impressions harden. Once your brain labels someone, it starts filtering new information to support that label. This is confirmation bias at work. You notice behaviors that fit your initial judgment and ignore the ones that contradict it. Over time, your first impression starts to look like a proven fact, even though it was never tested. Smart people often believe they are less susceptible to this. They think bias is something other people fall for. But intelligence does not cancel bias. It gives bias better arguments. You come up with clever explanations for why your impression is correct. You tell yourself you are just being observant. You mistake coherence for truth. This shortcut shows up in high-stakes situations. Hiring decisions based on vibe. Relationships written off too early. Ideas dismissed because of who presented them. Opportunities missed because the person did not match your internal template of credibility. In each case, the error is not malicious. It is lazy certainty. There is also an emotional component that rarely gets acknowledged. First impressions protect your ego. If you decide early who someone is, you reduce the risk of being surprised, disappointed, or challenged. Keeping people in boxes feels safe. Updating your view requires humility. It requires admitting you were wrong. The brain avoids that cost whenever possible. Neuroscience shows that once an impression is formed, the brain's reward system reinforces consistency. Being right feels good. Changing your mind feels like loss. So the mind clings to early judgments even when evidence shifts. This is why people often say, "I knew it all along" after the fact, even when they did not. The most accurate thinkers treat first impressions very differently. They treat them as placeholders, temporary guesses waiting to be tested. They notice the impression, but they do not trust it yet. They stay curious longer. They look for disconfirming signals instead of validation. This does not mean ignoring intuition. It means putting it in the right role. Intuition should start inquiry, not end it. The moment you assume it is data, learning stops. There is a simple but powerful reframe that changes everything. Instead of asking, "What does this person seem like?" you ask, "What would change my mind about them?" That question keeps your perception flexible. It keeps the door open. It prevents early certainty from calcifying into blind spots. When you slow down first impressions, you start seeing depth where you once saw labels. You notice competence that does not announce itself. You catch your own assumptions before they steer decisions. You give people space to be more complex than your initial read. The irony is that this makes you more accurate, not less decisive. You are still fast, but you are also adjustable. You trade premature certainty for calibrated judgment. Once you see how often first impressions quietly guide behavior, you cannot unsee it. You notice how many smart people miss out not because they lack intelligence, but because they trust their first read too much. They confuse speed with insight. They confuse familiarity with truth. When you stop treating first impressions as facts and start treating them as guesses, your thinking becomes more precise. Your relationships deepen. Your decisions improve. And you realize how many mental shortcuts feel intelligent while quietly leading you off course. Trusting internal narratives more than external evidence. There is a story playing in your head right now, and it feels true. Not logically true. Personally true. It explains why things happened the way they did, why certain people acted the way they did, and why your choices made sense at the time. It feels coherent. It feels intelligent. And that is exactly why it is dangerous. Smart people are especially good at storytelling, especially when the story is about themselves. You connect dots quickly. You assign meaning. You build explanations that feel deep and self-aware. Over time, those explanations stop feeling like interpretations and start feeling like facts. That is when internal narrative quietly replaces external evidence. Here is the uncomfortable jolt. Your internal narrative is not a record of reality. It is a comfort system. Its primary job is not accuracy. It is consistency. It keeps your identity intact and your emotional world stable. Intelligence does not weaken this system. It supercharges it. The human brain hates randomness. When something goes wrong, it wants a reason. When something works, it wants a cause. So it fills in gaps with stories that make sense emotionally. Smart people build especially convincing ones. The story has logic, motive, clean cause and effect. And because it sounds rational, it bypasses scrutiny. This shows up in subtle ways. You believe a project failed because the timing was wrong, not because of a blind spot you never examined. You tell yourself a relationship ended because the other person was incapable, not because of a pattern you repeat. You assume people misunderstand you instead of considering that your impact might not match your intent. The story feels fair, balanced, reasonable, and completely untested. Psychology explains this through narrative bias. Humans naturally organize experience into stories with clear beginnings, middles, and explanations. Stories reduce cognitive load. They make life feel understandable. The problem is that reality is messy. It rarely fits clean narratives. When evidence threatens the story, the mind does not update easily. It defends. Smart people often believe they are following evidence when they are actually selecting it. They notice information that fits the narrative and discount what does not. This is confirmation bias, but wrapped in intelligence. You are not ignoring facts, you are explaining them away. There is also the illusion of coherence. Once a story feels complete, it creates a sense of closure. Closure feels like understanding, but understanding without testing is just confidence. The brain rewards this feeling because it reduces uncertainty. You feel settled, certain, done. External evidence, on the other hand, is inconvenient. It is messy. It contradicts you. It requires you to revise. It threatens the story you have been telling yourself. So the mind subtly deprioritizes it. You trust your interpretation over observable outcomes. You trust intention over impact. You trust how things feel internally over what keeps happening externally. This is where intelligent people quietly get stuck. They keep refining the story instead of questioning it. When results do not match expectations, they add complexity instead of reconsidering the frame. The narrative becomes more elaborate, not more accurate. You can see this in people who say they have already reflected deeply on an issue, yet the same pattern repeats. They have thought a lot, but they have not tested their thinking against reality. They mistake insight for change. They confuse explanation with correction. Neuroscience shows that the brain experiences a small threat response when core beliefs are challenged. Even intelligent minds feel this. When evidence contradicts your narrative, it triggers discomfort. The faster way out is to protect the story, not revise it. That is why internal narratives are so sticky. The most accurate thinkers reverse the hierarchy. They treat their internal story as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. They give more weight to patterns of outcome than to personal explanation. If the same result keeps happening, they assume their story is missing something. Even if it feels right, they ask different questions. Not why does this make sense to me, but what keeps happening regardless of my explanation. Not what did I intend, but what was the effect. Not what feels true, but what is consistently observable. This shift is uncomfortable because it removes a familiar anchor. Your internal narrative feels like you. Questioning it can feel like self-betrayal, but it is actually self-respect at a higher level. You are choosing reality over reassurance. There is a quiet power in letting evidence challenge your story. You stop defending and start learning. You notice patterns earlier. You adapt faster. You become harder to fool, especially by yourself. When you stop trusting internal narratives more than external evidence, your thinking becomes grounded instead of elegant. You trade clever explanations for useful corrections. And you realize how often intelligence does not fail because it lacks insight, but because it listens too closely to the story it wants to be true. That realization changes how you interpret setbacks, feedback, and results. You stop asking, does this story make sense, and start asking, does this story survive contact with reality? And that question alone separates smart people who stagnate from smart people who keep getting sharper. Confusing complexity with depth, there is a particular feeling that smart people chase without realizing it. It is the feeling of wrestling with something dense, layered, hard to explain. When an idea feels complicated, it feels important. When a problem takes effort to describe, it feels profound. And when an explanation gets tangled, it feels like you must be getting closer to the truth. That instinct is understandable. It is also a trap. Complexity feels like depth because it demands attention. Your brain lights up. You are holding many variables at once. You feel mentally engaged. But depth is not about how much there is to think about. It is about how much closer you get to what actually matters. And confusing the two is how intelligent people end up lost in impressive thinking that goes nowhere. Here is the shock that cuts through it. Complexity often hides confusion, not insight. When understanding is shallow, the mind adds layers. When understanding is deep, it subtracts them. Smart people tend to move in the opposite direction. Think about how this shows up in real life. Someone explains a simple problem with a web of jargon and caveats. A plan becomes so nuanced that no one can execute it. A personal issue gets analyzed from 10 angles but never resolved. From the inside, it feels rigorous. From the outside, it feels stuck. Psychology helps explain why this happens. The brain associates effort with value. If something takes more cognitive energy, it must be more meaningful. This is known as effort justification. We overvalue what feels mentally demanding, even when the outcome is worse. Complexity tricks the brain into feeling productive. There is also an ego component that is hard to ignore. Complexity signals intelligence socially. Simple explanations do not always get respect. Dense language, intricate frameworks, and multi-layered reasoning make you sound smart. For people whose identity is tied to intelligence, that signal is seductive. Simplicity can feel like lowering yourself. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Simplicity is harder than complexity. It requires clarity. It requires knowing what to ignore. It requires understanding something so well that you can strip it down without losing its essence. That takes more mastery, not less. Neuroscience shows that the brain prefers familiar pathways. Once you build a complex mental model, it becomes sticky. Each new idea gets integrated into the structure instead of questioning whether the structure itself is useful. The model grows, but accuracy does not. This is why smart people often overbuild explanations. Instead of asking what is the core issue, they ask how many dimensions can I account for. Instead of asking what actually changes behavior, they ask what else could be relevant. The thinking feels expansive, but the outcome stays the same. You see this in strategy meetings that produce beautiful diagrams and no decisions. In self-reflection that generates insight but no change. In advice that sounds deep but cannot be applied. Complexity creates the illusion of progress without the risk of commitment. There is also fear underneath this pattern. Simple answers feel exposed. If you are wrong, there is nowhere to hide. Complex answers give you cover. If something fails, you can always say it was misunderstood or misapplied. Depth feels vulnerable. Complexity feels safe. What separates real depth from decorative complexity is usefulness. Depth clarifies. It sharpens focus. It leads to action. Complexity often delays all three. It keeps you thinking instead of deciding. The most effective thinkers are ruthless about simplification. They do not confuse reduction with ignorance. They know that every extra layer adds friction. They ask questions like what actually drives this outcome, and if I had to explain this to someone else in one breath, what would I say? There is a concept in cognitive science that matters here. Cognitive load. The more information you hold in working memory, the harder it is to reason accurately. Complexity increases load. Simplicity frees mental space. That space is where good judgment lives. This does not mean reality is simple. It means your relationship to reality should be clear. You can acknowledge nuance without drowning in it. You can respect complexity without worshiping it. One of the clearest signs of depth is when someone can explain a hard truth plainly and still feel confident. Not because they oversimplified, but because they understood the core well enough to let go of the rest. When smart people confuse complexity with depth, they often feel intelligent while becoming ineffective. They sound insightful while staying stuck. They think harder instead of seeing clearer. The shift happens when you start valuing clarity over cleverness. When you ask not how sophisticated is this idea, but how useful is it? when you notice whether your thinking is moving you closer to action or just further into abstraction. Once you make that shift, something changes in how you approach problems. You stop collecting layers and start removing them. You stop adding explanations and start testing assumptions. You stop hiding inside complexity and start standing on understanding. And that is when intelligence actually starts to work for you instead of against you. Because depth is not how much you can hold in your head. It is how little you need to hold to move forward with precision. Defending beliefs instead of updating them. At first it feels like strength. Someone challenges your idea and your mind snaps awake. You marshal reasons. You remember examples. You tighten your logic. The belief stands firm. From the inside, it feels like intellectual integrity. Like you are holding the line against sloppy thinking. But something subtle has shifted. You are no longer trying to understand what is true. You are trying to protect what you already believe. This is where smart people quietly get stuck. Here is the shock that most intelligent minds resist. The moment a belief becomes something you defend, it stops being something you learn from. Defense feels active. Updating feels passive. But in reality, defense is intellectual stagnation dressed up as confidence. The human brain does not like being wrong. Being wrong threatens identity. And for smart people, beliefs are rarely just ideas. They are proof of intelligence, consistency, and judgment. When a belief is challenged, it does not feel like a neutral exchange of information. It feels personal. So the mind switches goals. Instead of accuracy, it prioritizes coherence and self-respect. Neuroscience shows that when core beliefs are threatened, the brain activates regions associated with emotional regulation and threat response, not reasoning. Blood flow shifts away from areas responsible for flexible thinking. In that state, you are not evaluating evidence. You are defending territory. That defense feels logical because intelligence supplies the arguments. But the function has changed. This shows up everywhere. In debates where no one actually changes their mind. In online arguments where evidence gets dismissed instantly. In meetings where feedback is met with explanations instead of curiosity. In personal growth where insight turns into justification. From the outside, it looks stubborn. From the inside, it feels like rigor. Smart people are especially good at this because they can argue both sides. That skill becomes a liability when it is used to outmaneuver evidence instead of absorb it. You generate counterpoints faster than you process implications. You win the argument and lose the opportunity to update. Psychology explains this through belief perseverance. Once a belief is formed, people tend to cling to it even when the evidence that created it is discredited. The belief becomes self-sustaining. New information gets evaluated not on whether it is accurate, but on whether it threatens the belief. If it does, it gets attacked. There is also something called identity protective cognition. When a belief is tied to how you see yourself or the group you belong to, updating it feels like betrayal. So the brain works overtime to keep it intact. Intelligence does not remove this bias. It sharpens it. What makes this dangerous is that defense often masquerades as open-mindedness. You listen but only to respond. You ask questions but only to find flaws. You appear engaged, but the conclusion is already locked. The belief was never on the table. Over time, this creates a subtle decay. Your models stop matching reality. You explain away friction instead of learning from it. When outcomes do not align with expectations, you assume external causes instead of internal ones. The belief survives. Accuracy erodes. This is how smart people become outdated without realizing it. They keep refining old frameworks instead of replacing them. They mistake consistency for truth. They confuse confidence with calibration. Updating beliefs feels uncomfortable because it creates a temporary gap. You let go of what you know before the new understanding fully forms. That gap feels like weakness. Defense avoids that feeling. It lets you stay solid, even if you are solidly wrong. The most effective thinkers flip the instinct. They notice when they feel defensive and treat that feeling as a signal, not a problem. Defense means something important is being challenged. That is exactly where learning lives. They do something that feels counterintuitive. They weaken their own position on purpose. They ask, what would have to be true for this belief to be wrong? They look for evidence that would change their mind, not evidence that confirms it. They separate belief from identity. This does not make them indecisive. It makes them adaptable. Their confidence comes from knowing they can update, not from needing to be right. They understand that beliefs are tools, not trophies. There is a quiet relief that comes with this shift. You no longer have to protect ideas. You can let them evolve. You stop spending energy on defense and start investing it in alignment with reality. When you update beliefs instead of defending them, something powerful happens. You learn faster. You adjust earlier. You avoid being blindsided by change. You become harder to fool, especially by yourself. Defending beliefs feels strong in the moment. Updating them feels destabilizing. But over time, defense makes you brittle. Updating makes you resilient. And many smart people do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they turn intelligence into a shield instead of a lens. The moment you stop asking, how do I defend this, and start asking, what does this need to become, your thinking regains its edge. That shift is subtle. It is uncomfortable. And it is the difference between being intellectually impressive and being consistently right. Relying on mental speed instead of verification. Your mind answers before the question finishes. Someone explains a problem, and you already see the solution. You skim instead of reading. You decide instead of checking. And most of the time, it works. That is what makes this habit so dangerous. Mental speed feels like mastery. It feels like clarity cutting through noise. But speed is not the same thing as accuracy, and confusing the two quietly derails smart people. Here is the jolt that catches people off guard. Mental speed is not proof that you are right. It is proof that your brain is confident. And confidence without verification is how small errors turn into big failures. The faster your mind moves, the more it relies on pattern recognition. That is not a flaw. It is how intelligence works. You recognize familiar structures and fill in gaps automatically. The problem is that the brain hates slowing down to confirm those gaps. Verification feels redundant, almost insulting. You think, I have seen this before. I know where this goes. Checking feels like wasted time. But what your brain is actually doing is guessing efficiently. Psychology explains this through something called heuristic processing. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that allow fast judgments with minimal effort. They are useful when the cost of being wrong is low, but smart people often apply them in situations where the cost is high. Decisions feel obvious, so they skip validation. When the guess is wrong, the error is not noticed until it compounds. This shows up everywhere. You misread an email tone and react defensively. You assume you understand instructions and miss a key detail. You trust your memory instead of checking the data. You believe you grasp the argument and respond to a version that was never actually stated. Each time, speed feels like strength. Each time, accuracy quietly erodes. What makes this especially risky is that mental speed is rewarded. In conversations, fast responses look impressive. In meetings, quick answers signal competence. In problem solving, speed creates authority. Over time, you internalize the message that pausing to verify is a sign of weakness or uncertainty. There is also an ego layer that rarely gets acknowledged. Slowing down threatens the identity of being sharp. Verification feels like admitting you might be wrong. For smart people, that discomfort is enough to avoid it. You would rather be fast and slightly off than slow and exposed. Neuroscience shows that fast thinking relies heavily on automatic neural pathways built from past experience. These pathways are efficient but inflexible. Slow thinking activates areas responsible for error detection and adjustment. When you skip verification, you never engage those systems. The brain does not correct itself because it was never challenged. This is why intelligent people sometimes make mistakes that look obvious in hindsight, not because they lacked ability, but because they trusted the first answer too much. They moved on before the question was fully understood. They solved the wrong problem very efficiently. There is also a dangerous illusion that comes with speed. When you answer quickly and no one challenges you, the brain interprets silence as confirmation. Confidence grows. The habit reinforces. Over time, you start trusting your initial read more than external checks. Verification feels unnecessary because you have a track record. But track records hide errors that never got caught. The most effective thinkers treat speed differently. They use it to generate hypotheses, not conclusions. Fast thinking gives them a starting point. Verification decides whether it survives. They understand that the faster the answer comes, the more important it is to slow down and check. This does not mean second-guessing everything. It means recognizing where intuition ends and responsibility begins. In low-stakes situations, speed is fine. In high-stakes ones, verification is not optional. There is a simple shift that changes this pattern. Instead of asking, "Am I confident?" you ask, "What would prove me wrong?" That question forces a pause. It re-engages the part of the brain designed to catch errors. It turns speed into an asset instead of a liability. Highly reliable people are not slower thinkers. They are disciplined verifiers. They double-check assumptions. They restate what they heard. They confirm details even when they feel obvious. Not because they doubt themselves, but because they respect reality. This habit is invisible from the outside. People just see consistency, fewer avoidable mistakes, better judgment under pressure. What they do not see is the moment of restraint where speed was deliberately slowed. When you rely on mental speed alone, you trade short-term efficiency for long-term accuracy. When you add verification, you get both. You move fast and stay aligned with what is actually happening. The irony is that verification often saves time overall. It prevents rework. It avoids misunderstandings. It stops errors before they spread. But you only see that benefit if you stop equating speed with intelligence. Once you notice this shortcut, you start catching it everywhere. The urge to answer immediately. The impulse to move on without checking. The subtle pride in being quick. That awareness alone creates space for better decisions. Because intelligence is not how fast you can arrive at an answer. It is how reliably that answer holds up when reality pushes back. And many smart people stumble, not because they think too slowly, but because they trust their speed more than the truth. When you learn to slow down just enough to verify, your thinking sharpens instead of softens. You keep your edge without cutting yourself, and that balance is what separates impressive minds from dependable ones. Filtering out information that threatens self-image. There is a moment that happens internally that most people never notice. You hear a piece of feedback. You read a comment. You see a result that does not line up with how you see yourself. And before you consciously think about it, something tightens. The information does not land. It slides off. You move on feeling unchanged, convinced it was flawed, exaggerated, or irrelevant. That moment is not neutrality. It is protection. Smart people like to believe they are open-minded. They pride themselves on rationality, self-reflection, and growth. But this is where the shock comes in. The smarter you are, the easier it is to filter out information that threatens your self-image without ever realizing you did it. Your self-image is not just how you feel about yourself. It is a mental structure that keeps your identity stable, competent, thoughtful, capable. Once that structure forms, your brain treats it like something that must be defended. Intelligence does not remove that defense system. It gives it better tools. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Your brain does not process all information equally. It prioritizes information that confirms who you believe you are and quietly downgrades anything that suggests otherwise. This is not a conscious lie. It is an automatic filter. Psychology explains this through self-affirmation theory. When information threatens your sense of competence or goodness, the brain experiences it as a threat. That threat activates emotional regulation systems. The goal is not to learn. It is to restore psychological balance. The fastest way to do that is to dismiss, reinterpret, or ignore the information entirely. This shows up in subtle ways. You accept praise easily but analyze criticism aggressively. You remember feedback that supports your strengths and forget the rest. You explain away failures as situational while taking credit for successes as personal. None of this feels dishonest. It feels fair. Smart people are especially skilled at this because they can generate plausible explanations instantly. If feedback feels uncomfortable, you find a flaw in the source. If results are disappointing, you contextualize them. If someone reacts negatively, you tell yourself they misunderstood you. The explanation sounds reasonable. The threat disappears. The self-image survives. But something else disappears too. Information. This is where the damage accumulates. When threatening data gets filtered out, patterns never fully register. You keep running into the same friction, the same misunderstandings, the same limits. From your perspective, it feels like bad luck or external resistance. From the outside, it looks like a blind spot that never gets addressed. Neuroscience shows that the brain's reward system reinforces consistency with self-image. When you interpret information in a way that preserves how you see yourself, the brain releases a small sense of relief. That relief trains the behavior. Over time, the filter strengthens. You get better at protecting your identity and worse at updating it. There is also an identity cost unique to intelligent people. Being smart often becomes central to who you are. So information that suggests poor judgment, emotional missteps, or repeated mistakes does not just feel wrong. It feels threatening. Accepting it would require rewriting the story of yourself as perceptive and self-aware. So the mind chooses a quieter option. It keeps the story and loses the signal. This is why some smart people genuinely believe they have already done the work. They have reflected. They have thought deeply. They have explanations. What they have not done is allow information that contradicts their self-image to fully register long enough to change behavior. The most dangerous part is that this filtering feels like discernment. You tell yourself you are being selective, critical, sophisticated. In reality, you are protecting an internal picture at the expense of accuracy. You can see this clearly in people who say feedback never surprises them, yet nothing changes, or who claim to value honesty, but only when it aligns with how they already see themselves, or who believe they are self-aware, but react defensively whenever that belief is tested. The people who actually grow do something that feels counterintuitive. They assume their self-image is incomplete. They expect it to be challenged. They treat discomfort as a signal that something important is trying to get through the filter. Instead of asking, "Is this fair?" they ask, "Why does this bother me?" Instead of asking, "Do I agree?" they ask, "What part of this might be true, even if I do not like it?" Those questions weaken the filter just enough for reality to enter. This does not mean accepting all criticism as truth. It means not rejecting it automatically because it threatens how you see yourself. There is a difference between discernment and defense. One evaluates information. The other blocks it. When you stop filtering out threatening information, your self-image becomes more flexible instead of more fragile. You do not lose confidence. You gain calibration. You stop needing to protect who you are and start refining who you are becoming. That shift is uncomfortable because it removes a layer of psychological armor, but it also removes distortion. You start seeing patterns sooner. You correct earlier. You adapt faster. You spend less energy maintaining an image and more energy improving reality. Many smart people fail not because they lack insight, but because their identity quietly edits what they are allowed to see. Intelligence becomes a gatekeeper instead of a guide. When you let information challenge your self-image instead of threatening it, intelligence regains its real function. Not to make you feel right, but to help you get closer to the truth. And that difference determines whether intelligence becomes a ceiling or a tool that keeps evolving with you. Prioritizing being right over being effective. There is a quiet moment where things start going wrong, and most smart people miss it. You are technically correct. Your reasoning is solid. Your logic holds up under scrutiny, and yet the outcome is bad. The conversation shuts down. The plan fails. The relationship strains. You walk away thinking they just did not get it. But the real problem is simpler and harder to admit. Being right did not help. For intelligent people, being right feels like the point. It feels like success. It feels like proof that your thinking works. But here is the shock that catches almost no one early enough. Effectiveness and correctness are not the same goal, and prioritizing one often undermines the other. Being right is internal. It lives in your head. It is about coherence, logic, and justification. Being effective is external. It lives in the world. It is about results, behavior, and change. The mistake happens when smart people assume that if they are right, effectiveness should automatically follow. When it does not, they double down on correctness instead of questioning the strategy. This shows up everywhere. You explain something again, more clearly, more forcefully, because the logic is sound. You repeat your point in an argument, convinced that clarity will win. You stick to a plan that is no longer working because changing it would feel like admitting the original reasoning was flawed. From the inside, it feels principled. From the outside, it feels rigid. Psychology explains this through ego involvement. When your identity is tied to being smart, being right feels like self-preservation. Effectiveness becomes secondary because it does not validate the identity in the same way. You would rather lose the outcome than lose the feeling of correctness. There is also something called the illusion of explanatory depth. People believe they understand things more deeply than they actually do. When challenged by reality, instead of revising the model, they defend it. The explanation stays intact even as the results drift further away from what was intended. Think about how often this plays out in communication. You win the argument and lose the relationship. You prove your point and erode trust. You enforce the rule and destroy motivation. In each case, being right creates resistance. Effectiveness would require adjustment, empathy, or compromise. That feels like dilution, so it gets avoided. The hardest part to swallow is this: reality does not reward correctness, it rewards alignment. If your approach does not produce the outcome you want, it does not matter how right it was. Reality only responds to what works. Smart people often resist this because it feels like lowering standards. They confuse effectiveness with pandering or manipulation. They believe that if something is true, it should stand on its own. But humans do not interact with truth in a vacuum. They interact through emotion, context, incentives, and perception. Ignoring that is not principled. It is naive. Neuroscience shows that when people feel threatened, embarrassed, or invalidated, their ability to process information drops sharply. Even perfect logic cannot penetrate a defensive nervous system. If your correctness triggers resistance, it blocks effectiveness at the biological level. No amount of explanation fixes that. This is where many intelligent people unknowingly sabotage themselves. They focus on winning the mental game instead of influencing the real one. They prioritize internal consistency over external impact. They feel accomplished while the situation deteriorates. Highly effective thinkers make a different trade. They still care about truth, but they care more about what truth does. They ask questions like, what response does this create, and what actually moves this situation forward? They are willing to adjust delivery, timing, and even framing without abandoning the core idea. This does not mean compromising values. It means understanding leverage. Effectiveness often requires meeting reality where it is, not where it should be. That includes human psychology. There is also an emotional release that comes with letting go of needing to be right. You stop arguing with reality. You stop correcting people who are not ready to hear it. You stop repeating points that are not landing. Instead, you experiment, you adapt, you observe what changes behavior and what does not. One of the clearest signs of maturity is when someone can say, "I was right, and it did not work, so I need to change something." That sentence preserves intelligence while restoring effectiveness. The people who create impact are not the ones who cling hardest to being correct. They are the ones who notice when correctness is getting in the way. They understand that the goal was never to be right in isolation. The goal was to make something better. When you shift from prioritizing being right to prioritizing being effective, your intelligence becomes more powerful, not less. You still think clearly. You still value truth. But you stop mistaking internal validation for real-world success. That shift changes how you communicate, how you lead, and how you decide. You become less attached to winning arguments and more focused on producing outcomes. You stop defending positions and start adjusting approaches. And this is where many smart people either level up or stall out, because intelligence alone can make you correct. But only flexibility makes you effective. And confusing the two is how people stay right while everything around them keeps going wrong. assuming others think at the same level or pace. The mistake does not announce itself loudly. It feels reasonable. You explain something once and assume it landed. You move quickly through ideas and expect others to keep up. You get frustrated when they do not connect the dots you already see. Inside your head, the thought is simple. This is obvious. Why is this taking so long? That assumption is where things quietly break. Smart people often assume others think at the same level or pace they do, not out of arrogance, but out of habit. Your brain moves fast. It jumps steps. It compresses information. You forget how much processing is happening because it feels effortless to you. So when someone else struggles, it feels like resistance or lack of effort, not a difference in cognitive processing. Here is the shock. Intelligence does not scale evenly across people or contexts, and speed is not universal. When you assume it is, your intelligence stops helping and starts creating friction. The human brain processes information differently based on experience, stress, emotion, and familiarity with the subject. What feels like a simple leap to you may require several intermediate steps for someone else, not because they are incapable, but because their mental map is different. When you skip those steps, they do not follow faster. They disengage. This shows up constantly. A leader explains a strategy and wonders why execution fails. A partner explains a feeling logically and feels unheard. A smart friend gives advice that makes sense but never gets applied. In each case, the content may be solid, but the pacing is misaligned. Psychology explains part of this through the curse of knowledge. Once you understand something deeply, it becomes difficult to remember what it was like not to know it. Your brain compresses the process into conclusions. You forget the confusion, the trial and error, the uncertainty. So you communicate from the endpoint instead of the path. Smart people are especially vulnerable to this because their internal processing is fast and quiet. They arrive at answers without noticing the steps they took. When they explain, they deliver the destination, not the journey. To them, it feels efficient. To others, it feels confusing or overwhelming. There is also an emotional cost that often gets missed. When people feel left behind intellectually, they do not always ask questions. They feel exposed. Slower processing can trigger shame, defensiveness, or withdrawal. So instead of saying, "I do not understand," they nod, disengage, or resist later. From your perspective, it looks like incompetence or apathy. In reality, it is self-protection. Neuroscience adds another layer. Under stress, cognitive speed drops. Working memory shrinks. If someone is anxious, overwhelmed, or emotionally invested, their ability to process complex information in real time is reduced. When you assume equal pace, you unintentionally overload them. Once overloaded, learning stops. This is where smart people get confused. They think clarity equals brevity, but clarity for others often requires expansion, repetition, and pauses. What feels redundant to you might be essential for them. There is also a subtle ego trap here. Being fast feels like being sharp. Slowing down can feel like diluting your thinking or catering. But effectiveness is not about showcasing speed. It is about creating shared understanding. Intelligence that cannot be received is functionally useless. You can see this pattern in people who are respected for their brilliance, but avoided in collaboration. Others feel talked over, rushed, or made small. The smart person often has no idea this is happening. They think they are being efficient. The gap grows quietly. The most effective thinkers learn to decouple their internal speed from their external pacing. They realize that thinking fast does not obligate others to follow at the same rate. They slow down without dumbing down. They check for understanding instead of assuming it. They invite questions before frustration builds. This is not about lowering standards. It is about meeting reality. If the goal is alignment, action, or change, pacing matters more than brilliance. You cannot drag people to clarity by sprinting ahead of them. There is a simple mental shift that changes everything. Instead of asking why are they not getting this, you ask what step am I skipping that they need. That question turns impatience into curiosity. It reorients intelligence toward usefulness. Highly effective communicators do something counterintuitive. They repeat core ideas. They explain the same thing in different ways. They pause intentionally. They watch faces, not just logic. They adjust speed based on response, not preference. This does not make them less intelligent. It makes them more impactful. When you stop assuming others think at your level or pace, relationships improve, collaboration smooths out, resistance drops. You spend less time correcting misunderstandings and more time moving forward together. You also gain humility without losing confidence. You recognize that intelligence is not just how fast you think, but how well you can translate that thinking into shared meaning. That translation is a skill, not a concession. Many smart people fail not because they are wrong, but because they outrun the room and blame the room for not keeping up. Intelligence becomes isolating instead of connective. When you slow your delivery without slowing your thinking, your ideas travel farther. When you respect differences in processing speed, your influence grows. And when you stop assuming similarity, you start building bridges instead of gaps. That shift changes how your intelligence functions in the world. It stops being something that lives only in your head and starts becoming something that actually moves people. And that is the difference between being smart alone and being effective with others. Replacing curiosity with premature conclusions. At some point, curiosity quietly gets replaced by something that feels more efficient. You hear enough to decide. You see a pattern and close the case. You stop asking questions because the answer already feels obvious. From the inside, it feels like intelligence doing its job. From the outside, it looks like certainty arriving too early. This is one of the fastest ways smart people limit themselves without realizing it. Here is the shock. Premature conclusions feel like clarity, but they are often just curiosity shutting down. And once curiosity shuts down, learning stops, even if thinking continues. Smart minds are built to recognize patterns quickly. That is a strength. But the brain does not naturally distinguish between a pattern and a complete understanding. Once something feels familiar, curiosity drops. The mind wants closure, not exploration. It wants to move on. That is where things quietly go wrong. Think about how often this happens in everyday situations. Someone starts explaining an idea, and you think you already know where it is going. A problem shows up, and you assume you have seen it before. A person behaves in a certain way, and you decide what kind of person they are. You stop listening closely, not because you are bored, but because you feel done. Psychology explains this through cognitive closure. The brain prefers resolved states over open ones. Open questions create tension. Conclusions relieve it. For intelligent people, conclusions come fast, which makes the relief feel earned. But speed does not guarantee completeness. What makes this especially tricky is that premature conclusions often sound reasonable. They are not random guesses. They are informed shortcuts. That is why they are hard to question. You tell yourself you are being efficient, not dismissive; decisive, not closed. But curiosity and accuracy are deeply linked. Curiosity keeps models flexible. It keeps perception adjustable. The moment curiosity drops, your understanding freezes at whatever point you stopped asking questions. Everything new gets filtered through that frozen frame. This shows up in conversations where smart people interrupt not out of rudeness, but confidence; in learning where someone skims instead of engages; in problem solving where the first explanation becomes the final one. From the inside, it feels sharp. From the outside, it often misses nuance that actually matters. Neuroscience shows that curiosity activates reward systems associated with learning and memory. When curiosity fades, the brain shifts into efficiency mode. It reuses existing pathways instead of building new ones. That saves energy, but it also limits insight. There is also an ego layer hiding underneath. Curiosity requires admitting you do not fully know. Premature conclusions protect the identity of being competent and quick. For smart people, that identity is comforting. Staying curious can feel like stepping into uncertainty you do not need. But uncertainty is where new information lives. You can see the cost of this pattern in people who feel intellectually stagnant despite being capable. They read, listen, and think, but nothing really changes. Their conclusions are too quick. Their questions end too soon. They keep confirming what they already believe. The most accurate thinkers do something deceptively simple. They delay closure. When an answer forms quickly, they pause and ask what else could be true. They treat their first conclusion as a draft, not a decision. They stay curious a little longer than feels necessary. This does not make them indecisive. It makes them precise. Curiosity does not mean endless questioning. It means resisting the urge to stop questioning too early. There is a noticeable shift when you do this. Conversations deepen because you listen past the obvious. Problems reveal hidden variables because you do not lock onto the first explanation. People surprise you because you let them. Replacing curiosity with premature conclusions feels efficient in the moment, but over time, it narrows your world. You see less because you decide faster. You learn less because you stop asking. When you keep curiosity alive just a bit longer, intelligence stays flexible instead of brittle. You do not lose speed. You gain range. And that difference determines whether your mind keeps expanding or quietly starts looping on the same answers, dressed up in new situations. Curiosity is not a beginner trait. It is what keeps intelligence from becoming stale. And the smartest move is often not finding the answer quickly, but staying interested long enough to find a better one. Using intuition in domains where feedback is delayed, there is a quiet confidence that shows up when you rely on intuition. It feels clean, immediate. You just know. No spreadsheets. No waiting. No overthinking. And when intuition works, it feels almost magical, like evidence of deep intelligence operating below awareness. That feeling is exactly what makes this shortcut so dangerous when feedback is delayed. Because here is the shock. Intuition is only as good as the feedback loop that trained it. When feedback is slow, vague, or distorted, intuition does not get wiser. It gets overconfident. Intuition is not some mystical sense. It is pattern recognition built from past experience. Your brain stores outcomes, links them to actions, and gradually learns what works. In fast feedback environments, like catching a ball or reading facial expressions, intuition can become incredibly accurate. You act, you see the result almost immediately, and your brain adjusts. Clean loop, strong learning. But many of the decisions smart people rely on intuition for do not work like that at all. Think about career choices, leadership decisions, long-term investments, relationships, hiring strategy, or life direction. The feedback is delayed by months or years. Outcomes are noisy. Multiple variables overlap. Success and failure are hard to attribute to one cause. In those environments, intuition feels confident long before it is calibrated. That is where things quietly break. Psychology explains this through something called the illusion of validity. When a story feels coherent and intuitive, the brain overestimates its accuracy, even when there is no reliable feedback confirming it. You feel right, so you assume you are right. And because feedback is delayed, nothing immediately challenges that assumption. This creates a dangerous pattern. You make a decision. Time passes. Something good happens. Your brain credits the intuition. Something bad happens. Your brain explains it away as external noise. Because the feedback is ambiguous, intuition never gets corrected. It just gets reinforced. Smart people are especially vulnerable to this because they can build compelling explanations after the fact. If a decision works out, it proves their judgment. If it does not, they can identify 10 reasons why the outcome was distorted. Either way, the intuition survives untouched. Neuroscience adds another layer. The brain's learning systems depend on timely feedback to update predictions. When feedback is delayed, those systems rely more heavily on emotion and narrative than on data. That means intuition starts drifting away from reality and towards self-consistency. This shows up in subtle but costly ways. A leader trusts their gut about people but keeps misjudging hires. An investor feels confident in long-term bets without tracking actual performance drivers. Someone trusts their intuition in relationships but repeats the same patterns, convinced each case is different. From the inside, it feels like experience. From the outside, it looks like unexamined repetition. What makes this particularly tricky is that delayed feedback environments often feel high-level and sophisticated. Using intuition there feels like maturity, like seeing the big picture. Slowing down to measure or verify can feel naive or overly analytical. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Intuition without feedback is just confidence with a good story. In domains with delayed feedback, intuition does not automatically improve with time. It can get worse. Each uncorrected guess strengthens the belief that you are good at this. That belief becomes part of your identity. And once intuition is tied to identity, questioning it feels threatening. This is why people often say trust your gut, even when the gut has never been properly trained for the environment it is operating in. Intuition trained in one domain does not automatically transfer to another. Being good at reading people socially does not mean you are good at predicting long-term performance. Being sharp in one context does not guarantee accuracy in a slower one. The most effective thinkers understand this distinction. They do not abandon intuition. They put it in the right place. They use intuition to generate hypotheses, not final decisions. Especially when feedback is delayed, they build artificial feedback loops where natural ones are weak. They track outcomes over time. They write down predictions and revisit them later. They compare intuition with data instead of assuming alignment. They invite external perspectives to counterbalance internal certainty. This is not because they distrust themselves. It is because they understand how learning actually works. There is a subtle shift that changes everything. Instead of asking, "What does my intuition say?" you ask, "How will I know if this intuition is wrong?" That question forces you to define signals, timelines, and checks. It turns intuition into a starting point instead of a verdict. Once you do this, intuition becomes sharper instead of louder. You start noticing where it consistently helps and where it reliably misleads. You stop treating all gut feelings as equal. Some earn trust, others get flagged. When you rely on intuition in domains with fast feedback, you can move quickly and confidently. When you rely on it where feedback is delayed, you need humility and structure. Mixing those up is how smart people make confident mistakes that take years to surface. The danger is not using intuition. The danger is using it where it cannot learn. When you respect the limits of intuition, your intelligence becomes more durable. You stop confusing certainty with calibration. You stop mistaking experience for accuracy, and you prevent small misjudgments from compounding quietly over time. Many intelligent people fail slowly, not suddenly, because their intuition feels right and is never properly tested. The correction comes late, when costs are high and patterns are deeply ingrained. When you learn to pair intuition with verification in delayed feedback environments, something powerful happens. You still move forward, but you leave markers behind. You give your future self evidence instead of stories. And that is the difference between intuition that flatters the ego and intuition that actually deserves trust. Ignoring base rates because personal experience feels stronger. There is a moment where numbers lose to memory. You hear a statistic, a trend, a probability, and then your mind pulls up a personal example that feels vivid and undeniable. Someone you know beat the odds. Something worked for you once. You have seen this happen differently. And just like that, the data fades into the background while your experience takes the lead. That moment feels rational. It is not. Here is the shock that trips up even very intelligent people. Personal experience feels stronger than base rates, but base rates are usually more accurate. When you ignore them, you are not trusting reality. You are trusting what is emotionally available. Base rates are simple in concept. They are the general probabilities of something happening across many cases. How often startups fail? How often people change deeply ingrained habits? How often a strategy works across a population? They are boring, impersonal, and statistically cold. Personal experience, on the other hand, is warm, detailed, and emotionally charged. Your brain prefers warm. Psychology explains this through the availability heuristic. The brain estimates likelihood based on how easily examples come to mind. A vivid personal story feels more real than an abstract percentage, even when the percentage is built from thousands of data points. The easier something is to recall, the more weight it gets in judgment. Smart people are not immune to this. In fact, they often fall harder, because intelligence allows you to build sophisticated explanations around your experience. You do not just say this happened to me. You say this happened because of these factors, so the base rate does not apply here. You carve out an exception, and sometimes you are right. But most of the time, you are just narrating luck. This shows up constantly. Someone believes a risky career move is safe because they know a few people who succeeded. Someone underestimates health risks because they feel fine right now. Someone assumes a relationship pattern will end differently this time because it feels different. The base rates are clear. The personal story is louder. The problem is not that personal experience is useless. It is that it is statistically weak. One data point, even a meaningful one, does not override a distribution. But the brain does not feel distributions. It feels stories. Neuroscience adds another layer. Emotional memory is encoded more strongly than abstract information. When you recall a personal success or failure, the emotional centers of the brain activate. That activation biases judgment. The number does not stand a chance. What makes this especially dangerous is that base rate neglect often feels like insight. You tell yourself you see nuances the data misses. You believe you are accounting for context. In reality, you are overweighting anecdote and underweighting probability. This is how smart people make confident but fragile decisions. They build plans on exceptions instead of norms. They expect rare outcomes to repeat because they happened once. They mistake survivorship for strategy. There is a classic cognitive bias that explains this pattern clearly. Base rate neglect. When people are given statistical information and a vivid personal description, they tend to ignore the statistics and focus on the description. Even when they know better, even when they are trained to reason analytically. The mind does not ask what usually happens. It asks what feels relevant. This is why casinos stay in business, why lottery tickets sell, why people believe they will be the exception. The base rates are visible. The personal fantasy is stronger. Smart people often justify this by saying averages do not apply to individuals. That statement is technically true and practically misleading. While averages do not predict any single outcome with certainty, they are still the best starting point. Ignoring them does not make you nuanced. It makes you blind to risk. The most accurate thinkers reverse the instinct. They start with base rates and then adjust cautiously for personal factors. They ask what usually happens in situations like this before asking how am I different. They treat their experience as one input, not the deciding factor. This does not mean ignoring intuition or context. It means anchoring judgment in reality before layering interpretation on top. Base rates ground you. Experience personalizes you. Confusing their roles is where errors multiply. There is also an ego cost here that rarely gets named. Accepting base rates can feel discouraging. They limit possibility. They suggest constraints. Personal experience keeps hope alive. It says maybe I am different. Maybe this time is different. That hope feels good. Accuracy does not always feel good, but accuracy protects you. When you ignore base rates, you often only realize it after the outcome arrives. And when it does, the mind rushes to explain why this case was special. The lesson never lands. The pattern repeats. People who get better at decision-making do something quietly powerful. They write down the base rate before committing. They force themselves to articulate the general probability. They notice when their confidence is driven by a story instead of a distribution. Over time, this recalibrates intuition. The brain learns to respect statistics emotionally, not just intellectually. Experience and probability start working together instead of competing. When you stop letting personal experience overpower base rates, your decisions become less dramatic and more reliable. You lose some fantasy, but you gain stability. You stop betting your future on being the exception. Many smart people do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they trust the wrong signal. They listen to what feels strongest instead of what predicts best. When you anchor yourself in base rates and then apply judgment, intelligence becomes grounded instead of hopeful. You still take risks, but you take informed ones. You still believe in yourself, but you stop believing you are exempt from reality. And that shift quietly separates people who get lucky once from people who make good decisions repeatedly. Believing effort alone corrects flawed assumptions. There is a belief that sounds responsible and feels powerful. If something is wrong, just work harder. Think longer. Apply more effort. The idea is comforting because it puts control in your hands. If effort fixes mistakes, then failure is just a matter of not pushing enough. That belief is wrong in a way that quietly destroys smart people. Here is the shock. Effort does not fix bad assumptions. It strengthens them. When the foundation is flawed, more effort does not correct the error. It accelerates it. This is hard to see from the inside because effort usually works in other areas of life. You practice and you improve. You study and you understand more. You push and you break through resistance. So the brain assumes thinking works the same way. If a belief or plan is failing, the solution must be more mental force. But thinking harder inside a wrong frame just makes the frame more rigid. You see this pattern everywhere. Someone keeps refining a strategy that never delivers. They optimize details, add complexity, work longer hours. Everything improves except the outcome. From their perspective, they are being disciplined. From reality's perspective, they are committed to the wrong premise. Psychology explains this with commitment bias. Once you invest effort into an idea, your brain wants to justify that investment. Admitting the assumption is wrong would mean admitting the effort was misdirected. That feels painful. So instead of questioning the assumption, you double down. Smart people fall into this trap easily because they can always generate reasons to keep going. If something fails, they can explain why it just needs more refinement. The explanation sounds intelligent. It feels productive. It delays the moment where the core belief gets examined. There is also an emotional layer here that rarely gets acknowledged. Effort feels virtuous. Questioning assumptions feels threatening. One protects your identity as someone who tries hard. The other risks revealing that you were wrong. Neuroscience makes this even more uncomfortable. The brain strengthens whatever pathways you use most. When you apply effort to a flawed assumption, you are literally wiring that mistake deeper. Repetition plus intensity does not erase error. It automates it. This is why people can be highly disciplined and consistently wrong. The discipline is real. The direction is not. What makes this dangerous is that effort creates the illusion of progress. You are busy. You are focused. You are doing the work. That activity quiets doubt. Only later, sometimes years later, does reality force a correction. And when it does, the instinct is often to say, I just need even more effort. The most effective thinkers interrupt this loop early. When effort stops producing results, they do not immediately push harder. They pause and ask a different question. What assumption am I treating as true that might be false? That question feels uncomfortable because it stops motion. But it is the only question that actually changes direction. Effort is for execution. Assumptions are for testing. Mixing those up is how smart people exhaust themselves without getting closer to the truth. In science, this is obvious. You do not run a failed experiment harder. You change the hypothesis. But in personal thinking, people often forget this rule. They treat beliefs like muscles instead of models. There is a quiet relief that comes when you realize effort is not owed to flawed ideas. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to rethink. You are allowed to let go of an assumption even if you worked hard on it. Many intelligent people do not fail because they lack discipline. They fail because they aim discipline at the wrong frame. When you learn to question assumptions before increasing effort, your intelligence becomes lighter and sharper. You stop mistaking exhaustion for progress, and you finally give yourself the chance to move in the right direction instead of just moving harder. Overestimating control in uncertain systems. There is a quiet belief that feels empowering. If you think clearly enough, plan well enough, and stay disciplined, you can control outcomes, maybe not perfectly, but mostly. Enough to feel safe. Enough to feel ahead. That belief works beautifully in simple systems, and it quietly fails in the ones that matter most. Here is the shock. In uncertain systems, control is mostly an illusion, and smart people tend to overestimate it more than anyone else. Uncertain systems are everywhere: markets, careers, relationships, health, social dynamics. Anything with many moving parts, feedback delays, and other people involved. These systems do not respond cleanly to effort or intelligence. They respond to randomness, interaction effects, and timing. Yet the smarter you are, the more tempting it is to believe you can steer them precisely. This happens because intelligence is very good at creating explanations. When something goes right, you can trace the logic. When something goes wrong, you can identify what you should have done differently. The story feels coherent, and coherence feels like control. But coherence after the fact is not the same as control before the outcome. Psychology explains this through hindsight bias and the illusion of control. Once an outcome is known, the brain rewrites the past to make it feel predictable. You start believing the signals were obvious, the path was clear, the result was earned. That retroactive clarity feeds the belief that you can manage similar situations again. In reality, many outcomes were shaped by factors you never saw and could not have influenced. Smart people struggle with this because they are trained to look for leverage. They assume complexity means hidden order. Sometimes that is true. But in highly uncertain systems, complexity often means irreducible unpredictability. No amount of insight turns noise into signal. This shows up constantly. Someone believes their careful planning caused their success and assumes the same plan will work again. Someone micromanages people believing tighter control will produce better results. Someone tries to optimize every decision in an environment where luck dominates skill. From the inside, it feels responsible. From reality's perspective, it is misplaced confidence. Neuroscience adds another layer. The brain dislikes uncertainty. Lack of control creates anxiety. Believing you are in control reduces stress. That emotional relief reinforces the belief, regardless of whether it is accurate. Feeling in control becomes more important than being correct about control. This is why people double down on planning in chaotic environments instead of focusing on adaptability. Planning feels like action. It feels intelligent. But in uncertain systems, flexibility beats precision. What makes this especially tricky is that partial control does exist. You are not helpless. Your actions matter. But they matter probabilistically, not deterministically. Smart people often miss this distinction. They think in terms of direct cause and effect when the system works on likelihoods and distributions. So when outcomes vary, they personalize them. Success becomes proof of skill. Failure becomes proof of error. In reality, both were shaped by variance. The most grounded thinkers shift their mindset here. They stop asking, "How do I control this?" and start asking, "How do I position myself within uncertainty?" They design for resilience instead of prediction. They focus on downside protection, optionality, and learning speed. Instead of trying to force outcomes, they set conditions. They diversify. They leave room for surprise. They measure ranges instead of single forecasts. This does not make them passive. It makes them realistic. There is also a humility that comes with this shift. You stop needing to be the mastermind behind every result. You stop overcrediting yourself when things go well and overblaming yourself when they do not. Your ego relaxes. Your decisions improve. Overestimating control leads to brittle strategies. When reality deviates, everything breaks. Underestimating control leads to paralysis. The balance is understanding where influence ends and randomness begins. Many smart people fail not because they lack skill, but because they mistake uncertainty for a puzzle that can be solved. Some systems are not puzzles. They are weather. When you accept that, you stop trying to command the storm and start learning how to sail. That shift changes how intelligence operates. It becomes adaptive instead of rigid, calm instead of forceful, strategic instead of obsessive. And once you stop confusing explanation with control, you make decisions that survive reality instead of collapsing the moment it refuses to cooperate. Mistaking clever explanations for true understanding, there is a moment where understanding feels complete. You can explain the thing. You can connect it to other ideas. You can make it sound elegant, clean, coherent. And that feeling is incredibly satisfying. It feels like mastery. That feeling is often a lie. Here is the shock. Being able to explain something cleverly is not the same as understanding it. And smart people confuse the two all the time. Clever explanations are seductive because they reduce complexity into something that sounds right. They give the brain closure. They create a sense of control. When you can explain why something happened, your mind relaxes. It stops probing. It stops testing. It moves on. But explanation is cheap. Understanding is costly. You can explain why a relationship failed without understanding your role in it. You can explain why a strategy worked without understanding which parts actually mattered. You can explain a concept fluently without being able to apply it when conditions change. The explanation feels complete, but it does not survive contact with reality. Psychology gives this a name: the illusion of explanatory depth. People believe they understand complex systems until they are asked to explain them step by step or predict what happens when variables change. Confidence collapses fast. What felt like understanding turns out to be a story sitting on top of gaps. Smart people are especially vulnerable because they are good at storytelling. They can link causes and effects smoothly. They can borrow language from science, psychology, or experience. The explanation sounds sophisticated enough to silence doubt, both their own and other people's. But sophistication is not the same as accuracy. This shows up everywhere. Someone explains human behavior with a single motive. Someone explains success with a neat narrative. Someone explains a failure with one clean reason. Real systems are messier. Multiple forces interact. Causes overlap. Explanations flatten that mess into something mentally comfortable. Neuroscience adds another layer. The brain rewards coherence. When pieces fit together in a story, dopamine is released. That reward does not care whether the story is true. It only cares that it feels complete. So once you have a clever explanation, your brain treats the job as done. Curiosity drops. Skepticism fades. Understanding freezes at the level of the story. The danger is not that explanations are useless. The danger is stopping there. True understanding shows up differently. It allows prediction. It survives new contexts. It handles edge cases. It admits uncertainty where it exists. Clever explanations often collapse under pressure. Ask what would change the outcome, and the answer gets vague. Ask how confident the explanation is, and the confidence is borrowed from how good it sounds, not from how well it has been tested. There is also an ego trap hiding here. Clever explanations protect identity. They let you feel intelligent without risking being wrong. True understanding requires contact with uncertainty. It requires admitting what you do not know. That feels less impressive, so the mind chooses elegance over depth. You can see the cost of this in people who talk fluently but struggle to act effectively, in leaders who can explain problems but cannot fix them, in thinkers who sound sharp but repeat the same mistakes. Their explanations evolve. Their understanding does not. The most grounded thinkers use explanations as tools, not conclusions. They ask different questions. What would I expect to see if this explanation is true? What would contradict it? Where does it break? They are suspicious of explanations that feel too neat, especially when reality is messy. There is a simple internal test that changes everything. Can I use this explanation to make a risky prediction? If not, it is probably a story, not understanding. Stories explain the past. Understanding guides the future. When you stop mistaking cleverness for comprehension, your thinking slows slightly but deepens dramatically. You become less impressed by your own narratives and more interested in how things actually behave. That shift is uncomfortable at first. You lose the high of sounding right, but you gain something far more valuable. You gain models that work when conditions change. Many smart people fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they settle for explanations that feel good instead of understanding that holds up. When you learn to tell the difference, intelligence stops being performative and starts being useful, and that is where real leverage lies. Defaulting to familiar thinking even when conditions change. There is a kind of comfort that comes from using thoughts that have worked before. You recognize the situation. You reach for the same mental tools, the same logic, the same assumptions. It feels efficient, almost responsible, like experience doing its job. That comfort is often the warning sign. Here is the shock. Familiar thinking feels safe, but when conditions change, it becomes a liability, and smart people cling to it longer than they should. The brain is built to reuse what has worked. That is not a flaw. It is how learning normally functions. Patterns that once led to good outcomes get reinforced. They become automatic. The problem starts when the environment shifts, but the thinking does not. Smart people often miss this shift because their old models still sound intelligent. They still explain things cleanly. They still feel coherent. So instead of questioning the model, they assume the problem is execution, timing, or other people. This shows up everywhere. Someone applies the same career strategy that worked 10 years ago in a completely different market. Someone uses the same communication style in a relationship that has fundamentally changed. Someone relies on the same decision rules in a system that has new variables, new incentives, new risks. From the inside, it feels like consistency. From reality's perspective, it is inertia. Psychology explains this through status quo bias and cognitive ease. The brain prefers familiar pathways because they require less energy. New thinking is metabolically expensive. It creates uncertainty. Familiar thinking feels fluent, and fluency gets mistaken for correctness. Smart people are especially vulnerable because they have more well-developed frameworks to fall back on. They have theories that once worked, principles that once paid off. Success reinforces them. Over time, those frameworks turn from tools into defaults. The danger is that defaults operate quietly. You do not feel like you are choosing them. They feel like common sense. Neuroscience adds another layer. Once a mental model is reinforced enough, it becomes fast and automatic. When conditions change, the brain does not naturally flag that change. It keeps applying the same model until failure becomes impossible to ignore. By then, the cost is often high. This is why people are often shocked by outcomes that were slowly becoming inevitable. The signals were there, but they did not match the old model, so they were discounted. Reality kept updating. The thinking did not. What makes this trap especially subtle is that familiar thinking often works just well enough to delay correction. Results degrade gradually, not catastrophically. That slow decline is easy to rationalize. You tell yourself this is just a rough patch, or external circumstances are unusually difficult, or the old approach just needs a little adjustment. So you keep applying it. Smart people pride themselves on adaptability, but true adaptability requires letting go of thinking that once defined your competence. That is hard. Old models are tied to identity. They are proof that you were smart before. Abandoning them can feel like losing status with yourself. But intelligence is not loyalty to past success. It is sensitivity to change. The most effective thinkers develop a habit that looks almost suspicious. They regularly ask whether the conditions that made their thinking valid still exist. They do not wait for failure. They look for drift. They ask questions like, what has changed that I am treating as constant? Which assumptions were true before, but might not be now? If I were starting fresh today, would I reason the same way? This does not mean constantly reinventing everything. It means distinguishing principles from patterns. Principles tend to survive change. Patterns often do not. Smart people fail when they mistake one for the other. There is also a humility shift here. You stop assuming that past success guarantees present relevance. You stop defending familiar ideas just because they feel like you. You allow your thinking to update even when it costs you certainty. When you do this, something interesting happens. You feel less clever in the moment, but far more accurate over time. You catch misalignment earlier. You adapt before pressure forces you to. Defaulting to familiar thinking is easy. It is efficient. It feels earned. But intelligence that cannot let go becomes rigid. And rigidity in a changing world is fragility in disguise. Many smart people do not fail because they lack insight. They fail because they keep solving yesterday's problems with yesterday's thinking. When you learn to notice when familiarity is driving your decisions instead of fit, your intelligence becomes responsive instead of nostalgic. You stop repeating solutions just because they once worked. And that shift is often what separates people who slowly fall behind from people who stay relevant as the world moves on.